Hi, and thank you for purchasing my plans for my Workbench router tip. You not only have supported my channel, but when you have built my Workbench, it leaves you with a kick-ass Workbench that is a joy to work with. And in this video I walk you step by step through this process of building my Workbench. And although my Workbench looks great, it's a simple Workbench to build, even with some essential tools. Although some tools will make this process more straightforward. So I will give you some tips and tricks to make building this Workbench enjoyable. I hope you will enjoy this video and find it helpful. It has a slow pace and is meant to show the different steps in the building process. I will continue with a voiceover and wish you all the best in building my Workbench. Let it be worth it. I use a base of strips of birch plywood. And not only is this a very easy to build base, it is very sturdy and it looks good. And as an alternative you can of course use other plywood as well. I also have perfect experience with radiata plywood, which is much more affordable. And although I have a slider, I cut the plywood sheets into more manageable pieces with my plunge saw. And after that I started to make the small plywood strips. Although the strips will be 70 mm wide, I cut them 80 mm at first. The reason is that I can cut them clean and straight on both sides after gluing. However, this is not necessary, but it will give the most excellent results. The legs consist of two strips of plywood in the middle and two longer pieces on both sides. And I started to cut the inner pieces roughly to the correct length and glue the two parts together. And when you clamp, the two pieces will always tend to shift, so I use a nailer to prevent this from happening. And I use some clamps to press the pieces together. You see me also use some clamps at the side, again to prevent the parts from shifting. And you see that the pieces are already reasonably aligned this way, so it is not necessary to cut them wide at first. When the middle section is glued together, I cut them at the final length. And take care that you remove some glue first before placing it against the fence. Otherwise there is a chance your cut is not straight and you will see this gap when you join the base together. And you see I cut both sides, so both sides are straight. When that is done, we can glue the longer sides to the middle section. And I cut the two longer sides directly to the correct length. And you see me use a small piece to create a correct size overhang. And this is an essential piece of wood because it is my reference for the width of my base. Dit is een lijn. En als die lijn. Lijkt wel een pistool, hè? Lijkt wel een pistool. Ja. When the legs are glued together, I cut them at the correct width. First I clean up one side, and for the second side I use my reference piece to set up my fence to get the exact width. And this only counts when you choose to cut your plywood stripper wider than 70mm at first. When you cut them directly at 70mm, this step is of course not necessary. The upper and lower horizontal rail has two longer and one shorter strip. So I first cut the strips at the more extended size and then cut the four shorter strips to the exact dimensions. And I check with the actual legs to see if it has the correct length. And you see that the overhang of the legs does not cover the horizontal rail. But this is because we have to cut the horizontal rails to the correct width later. And that is why we did use a reference piece for the legs. Now we glue the horizontal rails together, and to align the shorter piece correctly, I use the reference piece again. And I place my clamps at opposite sides and at different angles to avoid shifting. I made my strips 10mm wider than the final size to cut 5mm off at every side. And the curve of my blade is 3mm, so if I have to cut smaller than 3mm, it will become a very nasty cut in terms of sawdust. So this way we keep the sawdust a bit under control. And for the final dimension I use the reference piece again. And the results are very straight and nice finished pieces that only need a little sanding before joining. You must clean the joint points and remove the glue when necessary for a good fit. Important when gluing the base is that it is square, so use some corner squares to get it perfect. I use my planer or sander to flatten uneven parts when necessary. Ultimately, you want two equal parts. Now it's time to connect the two sides with crossbars, and I use pocket hole screws to join them together. And when you use pocket hole screws, it is crucial to use clamps to prevent the two parts from shifting. I use some feet to lift the workbench a bit. Your workbench top must be flat and square. And my floor is perfectly flat, so these non-adjustable feet are good enough. However, I also install some adjustable feet in case I have to adjust them to ensure the workbench top will be flat. In the end, it's very well possible to make a lovely square and good looking base this way. And besides that, with all the strips, you get a very sturdy base with almost no wood movement. A perfect base for your workbench. My workbench top consists of two sheets of material. One sheet of black MDF and one sheet of radiata plywood, a better quality underlayment. And I use two sheets of material because it makes a more sturdy and massive top. You will notice this with micro vibrations during sanding, and you feel it has more mass when you work with it. However, my former workbenches consisted of just one piece of black MDF, which also worked fine. But I recommend using a top this way when you want it to become a full range workbench. MDF is usually very stable, but when your plywood is bent, ensure it is flat while clamping. I use some screws in the middle to get some pressure on this part. And after clamping, I will remove these screws.
almost hurting. Like you are, like you are in me.
I made my plywood piece a bit larger than the top to trim it later with my router. And this is because my piece of plywood was bent too much to get an accurate cut. And trimming it with the MDF part always works perfectly.
How can this be? Fibers in my holy body.
I will use some dog holes in my workbench, and to determine where to place them, I first draw where my router and miter track will come. Ultimately, when I started 6.2 and 8.5 mm from the edge, the dog hole grid was nicely spread in the middle and not in the way of the router and miter track. Especially the place you start from the side is essential, because when you want to place the dog holes in your apron, you need the same starting point. I use the UJK path guide system to place these dog holes, and I have a video on my channel that dives deeper into this system. It is an expensive system though, perhaps too expensive when you only use it for one workbench. But when carefully used, you end up with a near CNC accurate grid of dog holes. When you plan to use your workbench in combination with a plunge saw, this can be worth the investment. But it is relatively easy to work around it when your dog holes are not 100% accurate. So I do not consider it essential that your grid of dog holes must be 100% accurate. When you carefully drill those holes without a template, it will still be functional 90% of the time. Although the apron is cut from one piece in the plans, I used some leftover black MDF to make this apron. So there were 3 parts I glued together on the plywood. And I made a slight bevel at the edges so you will not notice this. But making it from one piece is of course more straightforward. Unfortunately, the shot where I glued the 2 sections together failed. So I will show you from my former workbench how I did this. And although this workbench consists of only one black MDF top, the principle works the same. After cutting a 45-degree edge on both sides, I used some strong adhesive tape that I placed on both sides. And the most essential part is that you align both pieces exactly, especially when you want to use your dog holes aligned with each other. I use some black glue from Franken. And Franken is a Dutch brand, and this glue is developed for this type of work. But I do not think it is available outside of the Netherlands. That said, some construction glue will work fine as well. The most crucial part is that it is square, so I use some corner squares for this purpose. When the parts are glued together, I rounded the edge a bit. You want to avoid sharp edges, so cables and the dust extraction hose will slide better against them. To screw the bench top in place, I will use some pocket hole screws. And it is not necessary to attach these pocket holes at this point. You can do this before assembling as well. But now deciding where to place them is more straightforward.
change, so I owe you two, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
With my former workbench, I placed a full cabinet with drawers into my workbench. And with my latest one, I did not. Instead, I created a frame that gets stability when you implement the MDF panels, which act as a glider for the drawers. This way you save a massive amount of expensive wood and drawer sliders without sacrificing stability. And for placing the frame, I use some reference pieces to ensure all the drawer blocks have the exact same size. And because I have used these reference pieces with all my workbenches, I can interchange my drawer throughout my workshop. Besides that, this way of mounting your frame is very straightforward and with minimal tolerances. The MDF panels act as a glider for the drawers, so let us take a closer look at that. I made a groove at every 70 mm. But be aware that the bottom drawer also needs to slide in a groove, and I keep it 50 mm from the bottom for some strength. I use 2 different sized drawers in this workbench, but the only change is the front. And because I made a groove every 70 mm, the front of the drawer is 1 mm shorter to give it space to slide under the other drawer front. And the same count for the 140 mm drawer front. The drawer at the bottom needs to be 50 mm higher. And I made these grooves with my dado blade, which is very convenient. But in my former workshop I used my router to make this groove, which also works perfectly. And the easiest way, however, is to glue a 9 mm thick MDF piece on a 9 mm MDF base. This way you do not need a router or dado blade, which is much more straightforward. To make the grooves a bit stronger, I use some ruby oil, but I think many products that protect your wood are suitable for this. Ultimately, you must realize that this is not a high-end solution, but it works great and it saves you so much money on sliders. And besides that, it's a very flexible system.
I can do an imitation of a man who's feeling good. I can talk a lot like someone who's not misunderstood.
Because we use the reference pieces or templates, one size drawer will fit all, so we can make all the drawers in one run. And I created a template to assemble the drawers on my micro jig workbench quickly. And I like my small micro jig workbench for making these templates. But I would not recommend a main workbench with micro jig grooves. I prefer dog holes over that.
On a page, you're living in a
The overhang of the bottom is 9mm on both sides, so I just have 1mm play on both sides.
Oh, I've been taken and forsaken every time. Oh, and it thrills me and it kills me inside. You know I still got your picture, but it's hard to take a look. It's in between the pages of my real favorite book. I used to know most every word, but now it's faded far away, and I've forgotten all my lines. The actor stayed.
I use a Yesem Master R lift in this workbench, and I must say that the Yesem lift is not the most effortless lift to place. You must make a tight fit, otherwise you cannot secure it. And it has just one point to secure the lift to the workbench top. The first hole is not that critical and I made it with my jigsaw. Unfortunately, I stopped my camera instead of starting it, so I cannot show you this. I clean this cut with my router template so it looks nice, but this is not necessary. The second part of placing the router is more critical, so I made a template with my laser.
To be where you so calmly sit. When I'm further my own, there it is. Catching only part of it. But just
And I use a lot of black MDF in my projects, and I love it. But if there's one thing I hate about it, it's the nasty dust it creates. It's even worse than with regular MDF.
to the sound. If I could give you more than half an ear. If I could give you more than half an ear.
I use my fence to align the miter track and my router template to make the groove.
I hit the brakes, throw stones into a quiet lake. What is it you're really saying? I turn the thoughts to little waves. Space on either side of every single word I write. could give you more than half an ear. If I could give you more than half an ear. Baby, you know I can make a mess. I can make a scene. Help me get the picture. I'll read in between. I'll give you more than half an ear.
Staying at home, turn off the phone, I will listen to you. You lay in the sheets, you hold look up above, sunlight seems like turn off the lights, the stars in the sky are turning so clear. And without the words, the feelings unheard can still be just as sincere. But something's not right. Something ain't right. Oh, something ain't walk in the leaves under the trees without any shoes on, and holding my hand to spin you around, and I sing you a song, and taking a breath like taking yourself to the hospital. And I feel